before I forget to do that. So yeah, going off of that, if you missed the first workshop, there is a link on the forum post because I posted it to YouTube. So you can go and review that if you want to. It's just a basic intro video to team building with a focus on balance. And so this week we have another team builder workshop, and it's going to be focused on stall. Hoeyes wants to know if my school is closed, and yes, it is closed. Hopefully I don't die. So yeah, first one was balance. I thought that covered balance pretty well. If like you guys want a refresher, I could always do another session on balance, but I think that's good for now. So now we're doing stall, and stall is rather unique and different from both offense and balance. So, alright, hold on, let me pull up my notes. Would you guys prefer to see my notes while I'm reading them off, or would it be best for me to just read it and keep this in the background? Because I don't know if that's the most visually pleasing background that I made in 5 minutes, but alright. I can do that then. Maybe that's why I feel so strange. Got it all, but I still won't change. Maybe that's why I can't leave Detroit. It's the motivation that keeps me going. This is the inspiration I need. I could never turn my back on a city. Alright, so this turned into a lot more complicated than I really meant it to be. But, well, I have the information, might as well share it. So, yeah, Inception. So, unlike other team archetypes, balance and offense, the goal is to weaken the opponent in order to sweep. Stall is different. It uses a number of walls to check offensive Pokemon, and the goal is not to die. And one of my favorite quotes, I can't remember where I read it, but describing facing stall is, the battles take forever, and by the end, regardless of who won, you're pissed off. Because that's stall in a nutshell. It's very annoying to play against, because nothing ever dies. So, besides that, you might ask, why would I want to use stall? Well, generally speaking, it is for the risk-adverse players, because it is a reactionary playstyle, whereas in offense, and to a lesser extent balance, you are trying to set the tone, set the pace of the match. In stall, you're reacting to your opponent, so you're letting them set the pace. And prediction-wise, I'd say it's the easiest to use. You have specific walls that check specific things. If someone sends out, I don't know, Azumarill, you know you've got Slowbro to check that. You're not going to send out Gliscor. You know specific walls check specific offensive Pokemon. So this is a good and a bad thing, because on one hand, it's very easy for you to know, okay, this is what I switch in. This checks that. But at the same time, your opponent knows that as well, if they have any idea what they're doing. So they know what you're going to switch in, more or less. So at that point, lures become very dangerous. I'm not sure if I talked about lures in the previous session, but basically a lure is something that carries a move that it normally wouldn't carry in order to beat a specific check. And again, a Salamence example. I know I used that a lot last time. But Fire Blast Salamence is a common one. because Skarmory hard counters most Salamence sets, so it's not very uncommon for them to run Fire Blast, because even uninvested, that can 2-hit KO Skarmory on the Switch. So lures are pretty dangerous to walls and stall, but generally speaking they have the bulk to survive at least one, and you can play from there. So another thing to note when deciding whether you want to use stall or not, they don't have as much room for creativity, because the goal is to wall the Kama sweepers in the current meta. Not all sweepers, because that's not possible. It is not possible to have 6 Pokemon that could wall every other Pokemon in the whole game. So you're focusing on the popular sweepers. But the popular sweepers are obviously popular because they have very few counters, defensively and offensively, but we're worried about defense since it's stall. Charizard X is a great example for Pixelmon in particular. It only has a couple of defensive checks, so you're going to have one of those on your team. You can't just ignore it or you'll get swept. Unlike that, offensively, there are plenty of other Dragon Sweepers that you can use on your team if you're not building stall, but for balance or offense, you can run any number of Dragon Sweepers, and with the right amount of team support, any of them can work. Stall's not the same. There are certain Pokemon that you have to have. Maybe not particular Pokemon, but they need to do specific things. So, moving on to types of stall. So, there is full stall, and there's what is generally called semi-stall. Full stall is what most people think of. You have all or almost all walls. Games last forever. They hardly ever die. And this is a team archetype I've had some success with. I enjoy using it. I will say that with full stall, I've probably had more 6-0s than with any other archetype. That's usually how it is, because if they can't break your walls, they can't kill anything. But that being said, when one wall goes down, the rest of them tend to follow soon after, because you ruin that team synergy. So semi-stall is really quite similar. It is again mostly walls, but the key difference is it will have 1 or 2 offensive mons. It doesn't really matter what kind of offensive mons. They can be sweepers. Scarfers are pretty common. But unlike in balance, the goal of these offensive mons is to support the defensive mons, which is the opposite of what balance does, where you have defensive mons supporting the offensive mons. So you have your walls, but you can't check everything with just your walls, so you decide to throw in an offensive mon or 2 that checks specific threats to your walls. So, I don't know, let me think of an example. It's not in Pixelmon, but if your team is really weak to Mega Lopunny for some reason, that's not a great example because Mega Lopunny's not good against walls, but you get the point. You could run like Scarfed, any Scarfed fighting type really, to beat that. So yes, they check specific threats, whether they be an offensive sweeper or another wall that your team can't deal with. So weather stall is also another kind of stall, kind of overlaps the other two, and it was very common in Gem 5, but it's not very common now because you don't have permanent weather, and it's really hard to keep that up on a stall team, even though you're switching a lot. So here's where it gets really complicated with roles. There are a lot of roles for stall teams, and I mean a lot. And that makes role compression key. And role compression is basically you want one Pokemon to do more than one job. Because if you try to fit all these roles into one Pokemon each, it's not going to work. You do not have enough room on your team. So some of your Pokemon are going to have to do multiple things. So start with, you're probably going to start with your main walls. which is your core, as we talked about last time. They have to have defensive synergy, obviously. That's what Stall is based on. You need defensive synergy. Scar and Bliss is most famous for this. Skarmory can check almost every physical attacker. Bussy or Chansey checks almost every special attacker. Your main walls have to be able to take hits throughout the match. So for that purpose, reliable recovery is mandatory. You cannot have your main walls getting worn down, and you're going to be switching a lot. So for your core, you're probably going to want one physical wall, one special wall. Here's some examples from Pixelmon. Certainly there's many more than just these, but these are just some quick ones I found. P2 is Porygon 2 for those who didn't know. I'm sure most of you do. So besides your main walls, we have hazard setters. Hazards are mandatory, more or less, for Stall. Balance and offense, you like having them. Some offense teams are based around hazard stacking, but not all of them. But Stall, you really need hazards, because Stall is all about switching. You switch a lot, your opponent switches a lot, so that damage really racks up over the course of the match. So, like your walls, your hazard setters want to be bulky, and they need to have longevity. So ideally you want recovery. It's not absolutely necessary, but you want to be able to set hazards multiple times in case they get spun away or defogged. And so obviously, suicide leads are not okay on Stall. Those are for offense. Now, the most common and useful hazard is Stealth Rocks. As I said last time, you really should have Stealth Rocks on every team unless you have a very good reason not to. But especially for Stall, they're very useful. They take a lot of HP from many setup sweepers like Volcarona, Dragonite, Salamence. And it's not hard at all to find a Stealth Rock user for your team. These are some options, but there are many, many more. As long as you keep in mind that they need to be bulky and stick around for a while. So next, the next most common hazard and useful is spikes. Spikes are actually pretty rare. You usually don't see those very often except on hyper offense, and not even all hyper offense teams. But they're very useful for Stall, as we said. Hazards are great. But unlike rock setters, there aren't a lot of spike setters, and of the few that there are, there's even fewer that are good on a Stall team. Like, for example, Frostlass is a decent spike setter, but not on Stall. That is a suicide lead. So, spike setters for Stall. Deoxys Defense can be. I wouldn't say it's the best one, but everybody likes it now because it got unbanned for Pixelmon. Fortress is a good one. And Skarmory, of course, also great. So yeah, you want to get Stealth Rocks and Spikes on your team if you can, and you really should be able to. It's not that hard. Next, Toxic Spikes. So Toxic Spikes are very rare. You're probably not ever going to see them except on a Stall team, and even then they don't have very much utility except in beating opposing Stall teams, because offense and to some extent balance usually doesn't care about Toxic Spikes because they won't be out on the field very long anyway. So yeah, they're great at beating opposing Stall, but they have the worst distribution of any entry hazard that you'll find on Stall. With the exception, obviously Sticky Web has worse distribution, but not yet, not there yet. So it's very hard to fit Toxic Spikes onto a lot of teams. I forgot to put some examples of good setters, but just off the top of my head, Fortress. Oh, I have it right there. What am I talking about? Yeah, so good examples. Tentacruel is a great one. More popular on Weather Stall, Tentacruel, but you can use it on anything. Nidoqueen and Roselia, that's probably going to be lower tier Stall. probably won't see that in OU very much. And, again, our friend Fortress. One of the only viable users of Talking Spikes. That's something he's got going for him. So here's Sticky Web. Sticky Web is absolutely useless on stall teams. Your team is built to take hits, you want to take hits, and you're all walls, so you're so goddamn slow that you're not going to be outspeeding anything, even if you do have Sticky Web. So, zero reason to run Sticky Web on a stall team. You're just asking Bishop to sweep you. No, moving on, let me check. Make sure. Okay. Make sure no one else was wondering where we were. Hazard removers. As I said, stall switches a lot. So hazard removers are just as important as setters. So since you're both switching, you need something to get rid of those hazards that your opponent might set. And to be honest, it's not hard for them to set hazards because you have little offensive presence, so they can usually find a time to set up hazards. So yeah, hazard removers, you're gonna need recovery. With a few, there are a few Pokemon that can get away as a hazard setter without having recovery, but they're very few and far between. And obviously, defoggers are a no-no. No defoggers. Defoggers get rid of your hazards as well, and you don't want that. So you're stuck with Rapid Spinners. And Rapid Spin, unfortunately, has bad distribution and even worse quality of distribution. The likes of Delibird get Rapid Spin, and I'm sure we're all grateful for that. But as far as viable users go, there is Blastoise and Mega Blastoise. Although that's not quite a Stallmon. But you can use it. There is Tentacruel. There is Starmie. And Fortress, again. So yes, you're noticing a theme, as well as with the starting graphic. Fortress can be an amazing Pokemon for stall, because it offers incredible roll compression. In one Pokemon, you can have your hazard remover set 2 hazards, and you can have a Volt Turner, or you can use Gyro Ball to smack the speedy glass cannons that try to set up on you. Now, what holds him back, and what makes him not the stall staple that we all wish he could be, is he gets no reliable recovery, and his special defense is rather weak. But nevertheless, on the right team, Fortress can shine. So, moving on with our hazards theme to Spinblockers. Spinblockers can mean a couple of things, but for the purposes of stall teams, this means exclusively ghost types. And that is the most common way it's used. So when you hear Spinblockers, you're thinking ghost types. And as I'm sure the term implies, these Pokemon block Rapid Spin, since Rapid Spin's a normal type move and Ghost Arm means normal type moves. So these used to be much more important before the defog buff, in which it now affects both sides of the field and gets rid of hazards, but you can still put them on your team because it helps against opposing Rapid Spin users. So again, while any ghost type can be a spin blocker, you want to remember this is a stall team, so you probably don't want to put like a Gengar on there unless it has a very specific purpose as a semi-stall mon, because they need to stay around for a while. So examples, we don't have a lot in Pixelmon that are very good. Sableye is easily the best. If we had Mega Sableye, that'd be amazing, but we don't yet. But Sableye gets priority on recovery, taunt, and status, which makes up for his somewhat not so great bulk. And his typing is rather useful, because it's only weak to Fairy. Mischievous and Dustclops are options at lower tiers, but I'm not going to recommend them at anything higher than probably like RU would probably be the highest I'd use them, because they're both extremely passive and they have no reliable recovery. So Spinblockers, optional, don't need to have them, but as with any of these roles, the more you can have, the better, is the way I like to see it. Moving on. Shufflers and Phazers. So, Shufflers and Phazers. Phazers means pseudo hazers, which these Pokemon basically are, they use Roar, Whirlwind, or Dragon Tail to shuffle the Pokemon out, the opponent's Pokemon out, and rack up entry hazard damage. So yeah, so you got all those nice hazards. What are you going to do with them? You're going to shuffle the opponent and annoy them to death, because you won't even have to touch them. You'll just keep shuffling them in and out and healing when needed. And another benefit of this is that it prevents setup sweepers from sweeping you, as they can't set up when you keep shuffling them in and out. This is especially useful if you have something like Volcarona that's trying to set up on you and you shuffle them out with Stealth Rocks on the field, because you switch them out a time or two and they can't switch back in anymore. They're dead. So some stall teams are entirely dedicated to hazard shuffling, and their entire goal is to just set hazards and then spam those phasing moves, recovering as needed. But not all stall teams are like that. You don't have to have shufflers. They're very useful, but they're not mandatory. It just depends on what you're trying to do. So Roar, Whirlwind users, those have pretty good distribution. Vaporeon, Heatran, Skarmory are some common ones. All of them fit quite well on stall. Dragon Tail's a little different, as it's a damage dealing move, which means it is blocked by Substitute, which is important because a lot of setup sweepers run Substitute. And it also has less than perfect accuracy. It's like 90%, 95%, I don't remember which. So it's not a big deal. It's not going to miss very often, but just something to consider. And users of that, Dragonite, Gyarados, Blastoise are all rather common. Obviously Dragonite's nice because he gets stab on it, so even uninvested you're going to do a little more damage. But the role of Dragon Tail is not really to deal damage by itself, it's to rack up entry hazard damage. So if it were me, I'd probably lean towards Roar and Whirlwind, but Dragon Tail fits on some teams. And the one thing to keep in mind is all these moves have negative priority, so you will be taking a hit every time you try and use them. This will generally happen anyway, because as I said, all your Pokemon are walls and slow most of the time, but you need to keep in mind, even against opposing walls, you're going to be going last. So moving on, we have Wish Passers and Clerics. So there are a lot of bulky Pokemon out there that, as far as typing and stats go, they're great walls. The only problem is they don't have recovery, such as Fortress. So Wish Passers are very useful to helping you keep those Pokemon that don't have recovery healthy. So Wish Passers are probably going to be mandatory if you're running walls that don't have recovery. So Fortress, you're going to need a Wish Passer, unless you can just play really cautiously with him, which is unlikely. So when you're looking for Wish Passers, you want something with a large HP stat, because the larger the HP, the bigger the wishes are. Something like Chansey or Blissey, one wish can fill basically any other Pokemon back up to full, because that's how gargantuan their HP is. Besides that, Vaporeon and Umbreon are great choices. Honestly, it just depends on what your team needs, whether that be typing wise or whatever. They each offer their own utility, but in OU, Chansey's the main one. Moving on to Clerics. Status is one of the biggest annoyances to stall teams, especially toxic. The other statuses aren't that bad, but they're still annoying. So Clerics remove that status from your team, and there's a number of ways to accomplish this. So Clerics can take on a variety of roles. There is Heal Bell, which has the best distribution of any of the Cleric abilities. And a lot of the Heal Bell users also get Wish, so that's good for role compression. And some common ones are Chansey and Blissey, Vaporeon, Umbreon, and Clefable. Again, just depends on what your team needs. All of them are perfectly viable. And then we have Aromatherapy. Does the exact same thing as Heal Bell, but its distribution kind of sucks. It's limited almost exclusively to grass types, and most of them aren't even good at it doing it. So all these users, Roselia, Meganium, and Vileplume, that's going to be lower tier stuff. Chansey and Blissey get Aromatherapy as well, but I mean, Heal Bell you'd probably just use anyway, so that's not really worth mentioning. But those are some decent lower tier Clerics for your lower tier stall. And then we have some pseudo Clerics, which is status absorbers, which instead of removing status from your teammates, you're switching in on the status so that you don't get it to begin with, because these Pokemon don't care about status. And good examples are going to be natural cure users such as Celebi, Chansey and Blissey again, and Roselia. Or Roserade, honestly. Like, Roserade's usually more common on balance and offense, but you can run Roserade on stall as well if you want. So now we have rest users are rare on stall teams, because rest isn't reliable recovery, because you have to sit there for 2 turns and do nothing. But it's usually a rest talk set if you're running rest. I can't really think of any instance where you wouldn't. And some rest talk users are going to be Dusclops, Suicune, and Snorlax. Most of those don't even normally get run on stall. They're usually like win cons for balance or something. But whatever. You can do it if you want. Again, Dusclops probably lower tiers. So, moving on. Unaware walls. Not exactly a category, I guess, but they're very useful because unaware acts as emergency check to set sweepers. So, say you played it wrong and suddenly that Dragonite has 2 Dragon Dances, and you're in trouble because that thing's gonna OHKO everything you have. So what do? You switch in Clefable with Unaware. Unaware ignores all stat boosts that the opponent has. So that Clefable just sees Dragonite as having no stat boosts in its mind. And on top of that, it can hit it super effectively and it gets recovery. So Clefable and Quagsire are the only viable Unaware users at all. I'm pretty sure, I don't think there's any that we don't have. I think those are just them, period. So you don't have to have one, but they're good for helping you when you have perhaps made a mistake and let something set up. If you don't have a Phaser, this can be useful to stop the set of sweepers. The only thing to keep track of is neither of these 2 Pokemon have the greatest raw bulk, so even though you can't boost against them, they'll still get 2-hit KO'd by some strong Pokemon. Next is poison types. So poison types are not exclusively a stall thing, obviously. Yuto wants to know how I can forget Beaverell. That is true. I did forget Beaverell, but that thing is awful. So we're not going to mention it. But yeah, so poison types obviously not exclusive to stall, but they are helpful in stall v stall matchups because when the opponent lays toxic spikes, you need something to get rid of that. And poison types absorb toxic spikes the minute they switch in. And toxic spikes are a really big deal for stall because they really kill your bulk. And that is all that you have, so you can't let that go. So rapid spin users can remove toxic spikes like any other hazard, but most of them, with a few exceptions, don't like being poisoned in the process. And clerics can counteract toxic spikes, but since you're getting poisoned every time you switch in, that's a lot of time using heal bell. So you really don't want to give your opponent that many free turns. So you ideally want to either spin them away as quickly as possible or absorb them. So for stall teams, some decent poison types are Roselia, Tentacruel, and Mega Venusaur. And Tentacruel has the added benefit of being able to spin away other hazards. Roselia has the benefit of being able to act as a cleric. And Mega Venusaur adds some offensive presence, I guess. Which can be nice for some threats. And finally, for full stall does not always have trappers. You could even argue that having a trapper makes it more semi-stall, but especially in Gen 7, it has become very common for stall to run trappers. And likewise, it's quite useful for us on the server. Because this is especially true with Team Preview, which we're trying to get everyone to start using now. But trappers are trying to isolate and eliminate specific threats to your team. Now, what constitutes a threat to your team could be anything. But generally, you're going to look at the team preview and see which of the opponent's Pokemon is going to be the most dangerous to your walls. Say, I don't know, your opponent has a Gyarados, I guess, and you only have one wall who resists water, and he doesn't have reliable recovery. You're depending on Wish Passing. So you might say, okay, that Gyarados is going to have a really easy time if that wall gets weak, or if it somehow dies. So I'm going to use my trapper, say Wobbuffet, to trap that Gyarados when he comes in and kill him. And then the rest of my team will have a lot easier time. It can also be used to take out defoggers. That's not quite as easy to do from Team Preview, because not everything always runs defog. Sets vary. But it is useful for keeping hazards up if there's nothing else more important that you need to get rid of. So types of trappers: Shadow Tag, Arena Trap, Magnet Pull. Those are the users. Dugtree and Wobbuffet got swapped, but I think you know that. Magnezone is not very common on stall, but if you have a particular steel type that you're afraid of, it can work great. Sorry, sneezed. So, yes, those are your main trappers. There are other types of pseudo-trapping, notably pursuit trappers, such as Charmeleon, Scizor, Snorlax. All of them come in and force out Psychic or Ghost types who might be spin blocking you or whatever else. And they use Pursuit as they switch out and will heavily cripple them. And that's quite useful for taking care of some threats that might hurt your team or get rid of your hazards. And then finally we have miscellaneous trappers such as Heatran with Magnastorm or Gengar and Celebi with their Perish trapping. And those are much less common, but they can be used for some teams. Gengar in particular can trap and be a spin blocker, so you can eliminate your opponent's rapid spitter. Even though he doesn't have the bulk for stall, he can work. Now, moving on to semi-stall. So as I said, these Pokemon take out threats that you can't wall and wear down. So this means they're going to be very team specific, and it's hard to give concrete examples, but they can be scarfers, sweepers, wall breakers, whatever, anything that's not a wall, basically. An example of some of those: Rhyperior, Heracross, Numerill. They all hit hard. They all have okay bulk. Heracross less than the others, but they can be whatever your team needs. Whatever you identify as a threat, find something that beats that. So, distinct from that is stall breakers and subseeders. So, stall breakers do what you'd expect from the name. They break opposing stall, because stall versus stall is one of the tougher matchups for stall teams unless you're really prepared for it. You can usually wall most balanced teams and a good number of offense teams, but stall versus stall can get a little tricky if you're not prepared. So what stall breakers do is they're different from wall breakers. Both deal with walls, but stall breakers are different in that they prevent the stall mons from doing what they want to do, usually through taunt. Not necessarily through taunt, but generally. Whereas wall breakers are just out there to kill or give significant damage to the walls. So the most famous is Gliscor. I know a lot of people on the server use that as a wall, and you can use it as a wall, but it's actually best at being a stall breaker. Heatran and Mew also do a very good job of this, as they all boast good bulk themselves, a somewhat immunity status, and they can trap. Well, in Heatran's case, he can trap. So to give an example of the Gliscor set, it'd be something like Taunt Toxic Saw or Taunt Swords Dance, something like that. Because most of the mons that you find on stall cannot deal a lot of damage. They rely on those status moves. So if you're just using Seismic Tossing to Gliscor, he doesn't really care about that because he gets so much health back that he can just set up as many Swords Dances as he wants and then sweep you. So finally, the last semi-stall category is the rarest, and they're not even necessarily just for stall. You can use these on whatever. But Subseeders, they use a combination of Substitute and Leech Seed to wear down the opponent. And the idea is that you come in on either a defensive Pokemon or an offensive Pokemon that can't hurt you very well, and you set up Leech Seed and you just spam Sub and Recovery. So Sub protects you from status and attacks, and Leech Seed and Leftovers or Black Sludge gives basically all the health you lost to your Sub back. And it works even better if you have your own recovery as well. So this works great with Toxic Spikes, as you're having a lot of residual damage on the opponent from Toxic Spikes, whatever other hazards you have, and Leech Seed. Things will die really quickly, and your opponent's immediate reaction upon getting Leech Seeded is to switch out, which is what you want, because you want them to keep switching and getting the hazards damage. So that works quite well with Toxic Spikes. You can use it without Toxic Spikes, but it's nice synergy. So good users of Subseed, you probably want to be fast, because you want to be able to get up Sub quickly before you have to take a hit. And you also don't want to be switching in that much. Bulk is actually not really necessary for Subseeders, because you want the Subs to be taking the hits and not you. So you don't really need to worry about it being the bulkiest Pokemon. So probably the best Subseeder is Whimsicott, because it gets priority on Substitute and Leech Seed. as well as having a pretty decent typing. Immunity to dragon moves, that's an easy switch in. Superior and Shaman are also good options. We don't have Shaman, but it commonly runs Subseed. But Superior, I think the most common set on the server right now is the Leaf Storm Subseed set, where you basically set up Subseed on something that you can't touch or can kill you, and you spam Leaf Storm when you can to get those boosts, and then you can sweep. It helps it break through a lot of things it couldn't otherwise. But yeah, Subseed's really annoying to face. So that's all the roles for stall that I could think of, and that was a lot more than I thought there would be when I first started this. Any questions about that before I go to the sample team? Take that as no. Alright. So we can move on to sample teams. Okay. So, we're building our stall team. And as I'm sure you've guessed from the theme of this, our first Pokemon that we are building around is Fortress. Simply because his roll compression is awesome. And we're going to give him leftovers and sturdy. For rapid spin, of course, for getting rid of those hazards on our side. And spikes, because it's hard to find good spikes users. And what else did I give him? And to help with those stall v stall matchups, we'll give him toxic spikes. Again, very hard to find users of these, much less one Pokemon that gets both. So very useful. Now for the last move, there's really two options. You can run Gyro Ball or Volt Switch. I'm gonna run Volt Switch just for switch initiative. Doesn't really matter what you want to run. Either one works. Physically defensive, since we'll have other walls who can take care of his poor special defense. Next, well, we have Fortress. Great physical wall. Lacks recovery though, so we need something that could take care of that. So let's see what kind of wish passers we got. Well, HP, high HP is the important thing. So just looking here, we've got Blissey, Chansey, Vaporeon, Umbreon, and Clefable. Those are probably the only options we have. None of this other stuff really wants to be running Wish. There are some weird Wish Salmon sets you can run. I wouldn't really recommend it, but you can. So on top of that, they need to have decent special defense because he's pretty weak in special defense. So Chansey and Blissey obviously have good special defense. Vaporeon's got pretty good special defense. And Umbreon has great special defense. Fable's alright. So what do we want to do? I'm gonna go with Chansey. Now type wise, weak to fire, resist fire. Strong argument for Vaporeon there, but I like Chansey a little better just for the extra bulk on both sides, thanks to Eviolite. Chansey's almost a staple on any stall team. There's very few stall teams where you'll find something that fits better than Chansey. It's very splashful, so you might as well use it. Natural Cure acts as a switch into status, very useful. And so we're getting it Wish, Protect so that it can heal itself as well. Alternatively, you could run Wish and Soft Boiled, but I like Wish Protect better as it helps scout for perhaps choice locked moves. And Seismic Toss so you're not taunt bait. And the last move kind of depends on what you need. Chansey has a lot of options, but I'm going to go with Heal Bell to act as a Cleric. And that is not the spread you want, generally. Instead, you're going to want something like that, because its HP is already huge, so you might as well invest in the lower stats. So now we've got our two main walls, and they have pretty good synergy. Chansey's weak to fighting, Forger's weak to fire. We can fix that later. So what do we want next? Well, we've got Toxic Spikes and Spikes, so it'd be nice if we could get a Stealth Rock user on here, as it's generally the most useful hazard. So let's see what we got for that. Heatran, decent on stall. Celebi, maybe, not quite as good. Mew's an option. Jirachi's kind of eh. Reggie's maybe for lower tiers, but this is an OU team since I have Chansey already. So not the best options there. Same with Uxie, probably lower tier there. We already have Chansey, we're not running a Blissey. And Poland wouldn't be bad, but that's another thing without recovery. Hippowdon would be nice if we got it. But what I'm actually looking for is Clefable. Leftovers, and this is going to be an unaware set because of how useful it is to stall. Clefable has a lot of sets it can run, setup sweepers, whatever, but we're going to go with the unaware wall. And Clefable also has a lot of support options, much like Chansey. So we're going to start out with good stab, and Stealth Rocks, Soft Boiled for recovery, and then lastly we're going to go with, could be anything, but I'm liking Encore. Always useful to lock in those setup sweepers. Clefable in particular comes in as a setup sweeper, can encore them into that setup move. Very useful, as she can then wear them down with Moonblast or set up rocks, and they can't really do anything about it. So your spread's pretty flexible. I'm just gonna go with defensive, as Chansey stops a lot of special attackers, and Fortress can stop most special attackers but not all, so it'd be nice to have a little more wiggle room there. So we've got all the hazards we could ever want. We've got hazard removal, we've got Clerics. Well, now we need to start looking at team synergy. So there's a lot of options we could go with here, but I like the idea of having something to check fighting types that might have poison coverage, because that's not uncommon. And Clefable, as I said, has good bulk, but not great bulk, so some more wiggle room there would be nice. So, can't do a Moongus because it's not here. So we'll go to the next best thing. In I think I went past it, but Venusaur. Mega Venusaur. Kind of unusual for stall, but it fits pretty well for our team so far. Weak to flying and psychic. Chansey doesn't care about psychic moves. Flying weakness might be somewhat concerning, but we can deal with that later. Neither of these matter, really. I guess Chlorophyll would be your best option, just in case you're facing a Sun team for some reason. But it doesn't really matter. And we're going to give you Giga Drain for stab. Sludge Bomb for stab. Leech Seed for residual damage. And Synthesis just for recovery. Not a Subseeder, despite having Leech Seed, as it's rather slow. Although there are some Subseeder sets for Venusaur, I wouldn't really recommend it, especially not No U. But let's see what kind of spread we want. No, I gave this a very specific spread. Okay. Am I gonna remember what this is for? Probably not. It's bold, right? Yeah, it's bold. Alright, so that gives us more physical bulk, but it's really mixed bulk, because Venusaur has great mixed bulk, which is always nice for when you're building a stall team. Mixed bulk is preferable over specialized. But the 16 speed EVs here is to outspeed max speed Adamant Azumarill, which is a pretty decent wall breaker, and Venusaur can check quite well. But it wants to outspeed it because some Azumarills run coverage specifically for Mega Venusaur, and if you're getting outsped, then it can kill you. So there's 4 members down. Now here we're starting to notice some gaps. Fortress, very weak to fire. Chansey doesn't like physical fire types, of which there are a few, especially that have fighting stab as well. Clefable doesn't really care about fire types defensively, but it can't really touch them offensively, so that's not great. Venusaur similarly, thick fat helps against fire types, but it can't touch them very well. So we need something to deal with fire types. So Heatran is a great choice, especially in conjunction with Mega Venusaur. They have very good synergy, as Heatran resists both Psychic and Flying, and Venusaur resists water and is neutral to ground, and it resists fighting. So what kind of set do we want for Heatran? Well, I like the defensive set. The more defensive set rather than the Trapper set. So we're going to give him leftovers, Flash Fire obviously, full point of Heatran, Lava Plume for stab and some nice burns, Taunt and Toxic for dealing with opposing walls. Can't trap them, but you can really force them out. And Roar for phasing, because we've got a lot of hazards and we want those to really reach their full potential by having all of that. So, oh, another spread that I came up with. This was timid, I believe. No, it was calm. Now, let's see real quick if I can remember what that spread was for. Oh, sorry, I have the, I have my stream on a separate browser. What can you do and use instead of Venusaur? Instead of Venusaur, well, it can absorb Toxic Spikes, so you probably want another Poison type. That was one of the main roles, at least. Also, it helps take on some of the fighting weakness that I have. So, alternatively, viable poison types for stall would be Tentacruel, Gengar if it's a stall breaker set, or Trapper, Weezing, Vileplume, Roserade, Roselia for lower tiers, or Golbat would all be fine. But as far as OU goes, you're probably going to want either Venusaur or Tentacruel. And even Tentacruel is going to struggle because it doesn't get reliable recovery. But if you're doing rain stall, I guess it could work. But again, Fortress is immune to Toxic Spikes and can spin them away, so you don't have to have a poison type on this team, especially considering Heatran is also immune. But if you wanted a different one, that's an option. So, what was I? I was looking for the Heatran, the reason for the Heatran spread. It was to outspeed something of minimal importance, I'm sure. It might have been no investment Gliscor, I can't really remember. There was a reason for it, but that doesn't really matter for the purposes of the sample team. But this gives me another check to special attackers, as Heatran has quite good special bulk. The one thing to keep in mind is both of our special walls are weak to fighting. Now, there's not a lot of special attackers that are fighting types that are special attackers. I can think of Lucario probably being the only one that we have that can commonly run special moves, and even he doesn't really break through Chansey without some nasty plots or something. But there are certain lures that run physical fighting moves on an otherwise special set. So you need to watch out for those with this team. But as I said, they're pretty uncommon. Okay. So we've got our team so far. Pretty good balance of physical and special bulk. It'd be nice if we could have something that could take ground type attacks for Heatran, as none of these guys really want to do it. Fortress doesn't have the recovery to deal with them consistently. Venusaur is neutral thanks to its poison typing. So, in addition, I'd also like to improve my matchup versus other stall teams. So we're going to go a little semi-stall with this and choose Gliscor. Now, like any Gliscor set, you're running, I always put that, it's Toxic Orb, not Poison Orb. Poison Heal. If you're not running Poison Heal, you're not running Gliscor. That is its only reason to be used. And in addition to providing the ground immunity, with Toxic Orb it provides another status immunity. So Chansey doesn't even have to run Heal Bell at this point, since she has Natural Cure and Gliscor can't be status, assuming Toxic Orb is up. So if you wanted to, you could switch out Heal Bell for something else, but it's nice for helping Fortress out. Fable, maybe if Heat Ray gets like paralyzed or something. But yeah, so Gliscor, I think I was running the Sword Dance set. Yes. Alright. So we're running the Swords Dance Stallbreaker with Earthquake, Knockoff so that you don't get walled by Gengar. You could run Facade instead, just for more general power, but you're going to get hard walled by Gengar, and this team doesn't do great against Gengar. As he can beat Clefable, he can beat Fortress, Heatran may be on the switch, and Chansey can't touch him. So we'd like to have something for Gengar. And finally, some more recovery, so that he can do his job throughout the match. And for the spread, we're running a bit specially defensive of a set, because it just helps it helps him take hits a little better on the special side. He already has great defense, but that little bit of special defense investment can really help. You can run full physically defensive if you want, but a little bit of mix is nice. So his job is to come in on another wall that can't really hurt him, so probably not a bulky water because he doesn't want to take a scald. But anything else like Chansey or whatever, he comes in on that, he uses Swords Dance to boost, and then just starts smacking those walls around. There's an alternative set that runs Taunt instead of Taunt Toxic instead of Swords Dance and one of the attacking moves. But I went with this because I like a little more offensive presence on my semi-stall, since these aren't the bulkiest walls I've ever seen. But yeah, so that's the team. Chansey is huge. If Chansey goes down, you're probably going to lose, because she can pass wishes to Fortress and Heatran. Both of them appreciate that very much. Fortress, he's nice for taking physical attacks, but once he gets hazards up and you know your opponent can't remove them, he's not quite as essential. So if he has to die, that's okay. But anyway, this is the team. Has pretty good type synergy overall. There's no real weaknesses. So yeah. Are there any questions concerning anything I've said thus far or this team? We're at just over an hour at this point. He can give me a fucking write-up. Now who the fuck I gotta snatch the mic from? Don't get the shit confused. You're not a person, you're delicious food. No matter your race, birthplace, or religious views. All you niggas getting chewed. I'll eat a rapper fitted cap first, and then I spit out his tennis shoes. Alright, I'll take that as a no. No questions on any of that. So with that, that is all I have planned. Unless anyone else has some just general questions, either about team building or a specific question about a team that you have. I know I did a rate my team last time. I can do that again if needed. Otherwise, that's all I've got. Okay, so I'll take that as meaning no questions, which is good, I guess. So moving on to this short little bit of business. Yeah, so basically, I don't know if you guys read the announcements that I put on here. I try to keep them pretty short and to the point, but workshops are going to be Sundays from now on, basically, unless I say otherwise. And these, like team builder stuff, or maybe once the meta gets settled and I start talking about the meta, they can be kind of time consuming some weeks, and I won't always have time to put together something for them. So I could do like mini workshops, which would be obviously shorter and can be on anything you guys want or suggest on the forum post. They don't even necessarily have to be streamed. I could just do it like in the Discord channel. Either way, if that's something you guys would be interested in, or you think would be helpful, feel free to comment on here. Or even if I do end up doing a full workshop that week, I can always fit your question or topic in at the end, like right now. But either way, if you guys have something specifically that you want me to talk about, I'll be getting to a lot of these things later, but if it's a very specific thing, I can talk about it after one of these. So yeah, that's what I got. Thank you guys showing up, and I look forward to seeing you guys here next time for offense, one of my favorite playstyles.